Thank you for joining us at Continual, the never-ending convention. My name is Jean Marie Ward, and I'll be your host for today's writing track panel, Sci-Fi Doesn't Have to Be Hard. Our goal is to expand your idea of science fiction beyond the cliches of gung-ho guys in uniform and last year's science. To help us, we've gathered a great group of writers whose science fiction runs the gamut from archaeology, to diplomacy, to mystery, to space salvage, to the Eurovision Song Contest. Okay, please welcome Jody Lynn Nye, Kyoko M., Larry Ann Martin, Nancy Northcott, and Catherynne Valente. Welcome and hello, everyone. Since everybody, presumably both on the panel and in the audience, has too many books and not enough time, I'm going to ask you all to give a brief introduction of you and your books, starting with Jody. Jody?
Hi there, I'm Jody Lynn Nye. I write science fiction and fantasy. I've published over 50 books and over 170 short stories. And my science fiction tends to be of a humorous bent, although not always. I've written medical science fiction, space opera, humorous military science fiction, which is going some, and a number of different things.
Okay, cool. Kyoko?
Hi, everybody. I'm Kyoko M. I write science fiction and urban fantasy paranormal romance. I'm actually a little bit new to the sci-fi game. I only started this particular series in 2016, so I'm still kind of learning the ropes here, but I'm really glad to be here and really excited to talk to other people about sci-fi.
Larry? He really isn't a Bond villain, just don't pay any attention to the background.
Just on Thursdays. No, hi, I'm Larry Ann Martin. I write under my own name. I have 2 books out currently, so I'm a newbie also. I have a space opera, science fiction, and I also have a portal fantasy. In the rest of my life, I'm a co-author and behind-the-scenes support for Gail Z. Martin, and we have a number of series in various genres.
Cool. Nancy?
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write the Boar King's Honor historical fantasy trilogy for Falstaff Books, and this is the first book there. And with Jeannie Adams, I co-write the Outcast Station science fiction mystery series. And one of the fun things for me about it is I get to play with telepathy in my stories because I think telepathy is cool. And I write several genres of romance, including paranormal, romantic suspense, and romantic spy adventure, which is kind of a mouthful. And that's pretty much me.
Okay, cool. Catherynne?
Yeah, so I write a little bit of everything. You wanted, I write it. I write fantasy, I write science fiction, I write for children and adults. I'm scooting in right under Jody at about 40 books at the moment. My Fairyland series for children is one of the things I'm best known for, but I also write a lot of science fiction as well. And it tends to run the gamut from the very literary and fancy Radiance through to the space opera called Space Opera, which is indeed based on the Eurovision Song Contest, all the way to the most recent Mass Effect tie-in novel. So my science fiction does the whole fancy dance all the way up and down the spectrum. Yeah, that's me.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about space opera. I mean, the concept is just so out there, and just what people think of when they think of out there science fiction, but even beyond that. So I'm assuming that the book had a rather unusual genesis. Is that correct?
It really did. It really did. It's the most ridiculous story of how a book got written. I'm never going to beat this story. Like, it's just so stupid. So I love Eurovision. I have for a long time, and I usually live tweet it every year. So I guess it would have been 2016 that I was live tweeting it. And one of my fans in the Philippines replied and said, "You should write a science fiction or fantasy Eurovision. Wouldn't that be funny?" And I tweeted back, "Haha, yes, that would be hilarious." And 5 minutes later, I got a DM from an editor at Simon & Schuster saying, "I will buy that right now."
Ooh,
Uh,
fabulous.
I had no ideas. All I knew it would be science fiction. I didn't want to do like a bard fantasy one. Knew it was going to be Eurovision in space. The contract still says Eurovision in space. There was no title. There was no synopsis. That's it. That's all it was. And like my partner said, like, do you have any ideas for it? As I'm signing the contract, I was like, nope, not even one. And even a week before I started writing it, I had 0 ideas. And it ended up being this insane thing that is both very rooted in Eurovision if you know about Eurovision, but is also a madcap science fiction comedy if you haven't. And on top of that, I did try to, though I was making the jokes, take all of the science at least a little bit seriously in it and create a very lived-in science fictional universe. So it ended up being such a labor of my heart from a joke to this thing that is just so much of me poured out on a page and then doused in kindergarten glitter.
I like the kindergarten glitter part. The question I have is, though you have written sci-fi before in various different subgenres,
Yeah.
how is the writing of this different than, say, for Radiance or?
Well, so there's 2 huge differences. One is that Radiance is an alternate history science fiction. It is, though alternate history often falls under the rubric of science fiction, it is both an alternate history and a science fictional story. So it posits that space travel was discovered around 1860 and then takes place in the 80s, in the 1980s. So there's so much research I had to do with Radiance, not only on history as it happened, but to rigorously think out how it would have happened differently. One of the loveliest nights of my professional life is I had a lot of friends over who are historians or hobby historians, and I made them a huge dinner, and we sat around the fire with drinks and talked about, we planned the history of the world if everybody had space travel at the end of the 19th century. It was wonderful. Radiance is also structured very unusually. Space opera is structured like a sports movie. Radiance is structured like House of Leaves. They're very different. But the biggest one was, and I know Jody will have something to say about this, was just that space opera was comedy. And I had never written comedy before. I had written comedic scenes in a dramatic book, but it's entirely different to write an entire book that is meant to be in the comedy section. And I'm a very quick writer. I write very fast. And I went from being able to, when I'm really going and I have a deadline, write 5,000 or 6,000 words a day, no problem, to working for 12 hours and having 1,000 words. Because all of a sudden there was another dimension. I couldn't just pick the right word to illuminate a character, or the prettiest word, or the most interesting word, or one that would illuminate world building. It had to be the funniest one as well. So it led to a lot of conversations about what's the funniest fruit or the funniest animal. And these notions about my choices that I had never had to manage, keep in the air with all the other balls I'm used to juggling. So I really learned a lot writing space opera because I had just never done it before.
Kyoko, you tackled something that would seem to require quite a lot of research. You've got an archaeologist on one hand and scientifically based dragons. You've got to come up with a reason why dragons appeared, why they went extinct, and how they could be brought back. Did research play a large role in that? Or, how large a role? I guess I shouldn't say did it. The answer is yes. How large a role, and what sort of things did you have to go into?
So that was actually part of a large, I would say the bulk of the writing of the process of making of Cinder and Bone was that research. It was actually why I was hesitant at first to go after the idea, because I knew, I was like, oh my God, if I write an actual science fiction book about what if dragons were real and they aligned themselves with actual science, I was like, okay, that's going to take solid 3 months of research at minimum. And so what I ended up doing was I sent this big email blast to, actually what I did was I was like, okay, right. So let's start with Jack. Jack is the one who basically takes the DNA and has a grant program to figure out how to clone the dragons back into existence. I was like, all right, so let's start small with him. What would be his major when he was in college? What would be the postdoc program? And so after I did that, I went to MIT's website And so I did a bunch of really intuitive like research and looked around. I was like, all right, well, if we were going to do this, and it would be in this department. So then I went to their faculty list and I sent them this email blast, and I was like, okay, I know this is going to sound really weird, but would one of you postdocs like to talk to me about this particular idea that I have? And so I think I got 2 referrals. Like a couple of them answered like, oh, okay, well, I don't think this is my department, I'm going to refer you. And that brought me to a lady, I believe her name is Christina Bartoli, and she was a postdoc at MIT. And I laid out the idea of the book to her, and I was like, I know this is super weird, but would you like to help me in terms of setting up like what it would look like if you had like an actual like fellowship award in order to try to clone dragons back to life? She's like, okay, sure, that sounds really fun. And so she and I spoke 2 different times for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. And so, which was so sweet and generous of her. And I came up with this list of the weirdest questions about MIT and about the different research that she actually did. And she was so, so sweet and very, very helpful. And she was able to roll with the punches because I know I asked her a bunch of really crazy things. But like I said, I would say in terms of before I even put words on a page, it was about a solid 90 days of research. And that was between like the stuff I needed to set up at MIT and then the actual dragon science itself. I pulled that from a lot of different sources. So there were things of researching reptiles, there were researching birds, there was researching dinosaurs. And then, like I said, I put all of that on top of the stuff that I knew about what it would be like if they were at MIT. And so after I did all of those fun things, I finally got some words on the paper, and I tried my absolute best to make it sound like it was a completely viable option for this, for these amazing creatures to be real and to be in a real life context. And so that was part of why what took so long is looking at not only just their biology, their physiology, their behavior, and how they would affect the rest of the world if they happen to be real and just happen to be hunted to extinction at a point in around like I think the 1400s is where I have it set. I haven't picked like a specific year, but that was the other thing, is that this also is an alternate version of history, because so for example, if they were hunted at that point, that means that the Americas were discovered a lot earlier than they would have been in our history. So little things like that I had to kind of tweak as well to make sure that it made sense.
A lot of alternate history there.
Mm-hmm.
Larry, you take archaeology and in a different direction with a jaded ex-soldier. What prompted you to write a story about a junk collector in space?
Origins actually convinced us to do that. It's an odd start to a story. Gail was really swamped at the time and had to do Origins convention. And one of the things they often ask their people to do is to start with a submission of a story to include in their anthology. Science fiction wasn't her specialty or something she hadn't dabbled in, so I got to help. So we started with a short story. And after we finished the short story, we decided, well, gee, why not expand this into an entire series? So that's how it got its genesis. And what we wanted was more of a political drama that was set in space. It's not really hard science. It's more about the people, the relationships, and espionage and crime and people doing bad things like we might see in the real world. So we started with a character we thought people could identify, which was a disillusioned soldier who was a hero, who left the military because he saw things that he wasn't supposed to see and decided, no, I'm ready to move on. I wasn't really fighting for the good guys. I'm just going to go off and do my own thing and pretty much hide from the universe, until he discovers an archaeologist who had a bad run-in with some biotech that she wasn't expecting. And there begins their adventure. And not intentionally, but unintentionally, working against the system to help the people who are being persecuted.
And interesting that you both have archaeology and biotech involved there. Nancy, the Outcast Station novels have a basis in biotech. That's what sets up their universe, ultimately. But what your concern is mystery in space. What led you in that direction?
Well, Jeannie and I had been to RavenCon and had been to a panel on what is science, what is space opera. And we were talking afterwards, and I said, you know, I kind of like to write some space opera. And she said, me too. Do you want to do it together? Now, I should backtrack and say that to us, space opera is science fiction without the hard science. And that may not be the definition of anyone else in the universe, but it's the definition that we use. And so we planned the world and came up with a system and an explanation for why it could be kind of Earth-like, because that was more of a comfort zone for us than creating everything new. So these are planets that were settled by Terran federations a couple of centuries ago. And to me, a good mystery, a good murder story is a lot of fun. But by setting it in the future, I could use tech that a detective now couldn't use. You know, we basically walked our tech forward a bit. And so I thought, well, it's nice to read somebody who's, as Larry said, working against the system. And so my character is a marshal who's the new guy on the station, on the outpost. And he's there because he ticked off his last boss. And unbeknownst to him, until he arrives, his last boss is a really good buddy of his new boss. And Jeannie and I call Outcast Station the armpit of human space where careers go to die. So it's always kind of fun to write a story about somebody who's fighting an uphill battle against something. And so that was my story. And then with Jeannie's, she's more, well, let's just put it this way. Jeannie likes plants and I kill them. So her story has a lot to do with plants and science based on plants. And so her character is also an outcast in a different sort of way. And so we had a lot of fun with that.
That's Jeannie Adams, I should add.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to. Jody, diplomacy is an underappreciated plot device and a generator of conflict. Despite the fact we have examples of both in real life, you don't see it a heck of a lot in fiction. What prompted you to focus on interplanetary diplomacy in your Imperium novels and stick a far future version of Jeeves and Wooster in the mix?
That is one of the most perfect pairings in literature, as far as I'm concerned. Jeeves and Wooster, the feckless young lordling or a man about the galaxy, and the self-effacing gentleman who tries to keep him from getting in too much trouble. Thomas, as both Nancy and Larry are talking about people who are outside the system or fighting against the system, Thomas is part of the system. Lord Thomas Kanago is a cousin of the Emperor of the Imperium, which is where my novels take place. So he will be sent out on missions on behalf of the Imperium, but he has a bad habit of wanting to do everything his own way. So this is where the humor comes in. And I love space opera for the fact that as long as the story is good and you stick to continuity, continuity is your god, you can get away with quite a lot. In my universe, my Imperium universe, travel in space takes no longer than maybe a few weeks, and even traveling at multiples of the speed of light, everybody is still the same age that they were when you left, plus or minus a few weeks. So I avoid what Chuck Gannon is doing, which is very hard science fiction indeed, and more power to him. It's just not the kind of story I'm telling. So Thomas travels to the autocracy where he is going to meet the autocrat, who is actually a teenage girl. She may look like a lizard, but she is a teenage girl. So winning over her government and overturning the very real corruption that's going on underneath. There's a very seamy underbelly that diplomats have to be aware of unofficially. and unaware of officially. So they have to be able to negotiate from a point knowing they may not be speaking to the person who can actually make the decisions. They may be speaking to someone who has no input whatsoever. It might be purely a figurehead, whether or not that person actually knows they are only a figurehead. So it was fun to play with. Also, keeping in mind the fact that Thomas has a knack for, because he is very observant, he seems to stumble into things, but he is actually acting on instincts based upon what he actually does observe. And I have a lot of fun with that. Space opera is huge fun. I mean, Star Wars is space opera. So we have the trappings of science, and science must indeed be involved in the solution of the problem which comes up, whether it be a diplomatic one, a scientific one, a sociological one. But in the end, we want to have a romp. And I think that's one of the reasons people love to pick up space opera.
Did you focus more on the hard science in your other series? Or was it also space opera?
There's actually science in all of my Thomas books.
Okay.
In the first one, it's psychology based upon optical realities. People respond strongly to symmetry. And that is one of the bases for the nobles of the Imperium having the authority that they do.
Because they're prettier than other people?
In a way. They are absolutely symmetrical, which they've done studies with this, and babies respond to symmetrical faces with alacrity, and they're very frightened of asymmetrical faces. And it's very interesting to observe that. But there's more to it than that. There was genetic manipulation involved, and so on throughout those novels. In my medical science fiction, the science is real. It's just extrapolated farther forward than we have done currently. When I was writing one of my, I think it was medicine show, I got in touch with my brother who was a neuroscientist, and I said, Jeff, I need a plague. So he went through his books and he came up with one, and I jimmied the germs so they were not immediately identifiable as modernized Earth bacteria pathogens. So there's science in all of it. I can legitimately call them science fiction.
Well, I think from what I'm hearing, there is science in everybody's stuff, and there's a lot of research involved, even if you think you're playing in space opera. I mean, you're talking about biology and the psychology of symmetry, and then gene manipulation to produce that symmetry. Yep. Kyoko was talking about the evolution of dinosaurs, okay? Catherynne, I mean, I can't even begin with, but you researched a lot on the Eurovisions.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that, so one of the biggest sort of real science projects of writing space opera was that all of the alien species, almost all of them, are based on some species from Earth. Extremophiles, sea squirts, the dominant species in the galaxy, the sort of the Brits, yeah, the British Empire, are sea squirts. And
that's funny.
And they reproduce the way sea squirts do, which means they bud their children off their bodies. So, you know, when you translate this through comedy, it becomes the universe's most radical form of attachment parenting.
Yes.
And so each one of them has a biology that is very grounded in the incredible variety of creatures that we have even just on our own planet. I think there might be one or two that deviate from being based on an Earth species, but I'm really only saying that to cover my ass because I'm pretty sure it's all of them. There's one that are time traveling red pandas, but what that means is that you know, their ships are related to their biology just as our ships are related to our biology, because anybody's ship has to support the creature that flies in it. And so there's an entire discussion about how much longer it takes aquatic species to discover space flight, because they have to deal with transporting water for themselves and that sort of thing, with jokes. but also I had to determine how each of these species would create music, how they would play it, what an instrument would mean to them, whether a vocal, whether they could produce a vocal sound, what that would mean for them, what kind of beats, what kind of time signatures. One of the sort of macro jokes of the book is the alien music is nothing like human music. So they're all huge fans of Yoko Ono. Not a popular musician on Earth, because they like screamy music. So I had to think through in very serious biological ways how each of these bodies would evolve music. And I think that when we have panels like this about hard science fiction as opposed to medium over easy science fiction, sunny side up, we need to define what science means, because a lot of people find that biology doesn't count in terms of science fiction, even though biology should count. But when you think of hard science fiction books, you don't often think of ones that are super grounded in biology. Usually it's technology that is the hard part. It's the hardware, not the software, and not the gushy wetware that people focus on books that in popular culture are thought of as hard science fiction. But there's a lot of sciences out there, and psychology is also a very serious scientific field. So I think that when we talk about hard science fiction, we actually often pre-limit ourselves to what some certain group of people have decided is acceptable as real science.
It's generally physics, yeah.
Yeah, physics. But I mean, what does that mean to have hard physics? Because there was a whole movement led by Charles Stross and Kim Stanley Robinson about mundane science fiction, where it had to, in order to qualify, it could only be science that we know and understand now, very, very rooted in reality and taken into the future, but rooted in our own understanding of science. And that's great for them. I never had any interest in that because I don't think that we understand science fully now. I think that in 50 years, we're going to look back on where we're at now and think it's ridiculous. Kind of like when we look at punch card computers, it doesn't bear any resemblance to what we think of as a computer now. But that's an aspect of hard or not hard science fiction as well. A wormhole is not hard science fiction. That is a theoretical construct. However, it is a plausible theoretical construct and therefore counts as hard science fiction.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the reasons we're having this panel, is to have those discussions about what constitutes science fiction. And I think it's a bit bigger than the size of your rocket pack, but I won't go there. Anyway, Larry, what kind of research did you do for Salvage Rat?
A lot of reading and a lot of talking to the experts that we know. So the one I refer to most, and I read, I think, all of the books that he had out, is Michio Kaku, who has a series of books about physics and the reality of looking at science fiction, and different books look at different pieces, but looking at what has been proposed, such as Star Wars or Star Trek, and saying, okay, how much of this is plausible? What pieces are plausible? What could happen in the next 50 years, or what would happen eventually? And that's where we used a lot of our science. For the more tactical, fortunately, we have an incredible network of writers who happen to be physicists and scientists, many working for NASA, who actually helped us come up with some of the pieces and helped us beta read pieces of it to say, okay, is this plausible? Would it work? Because ours is not based on the science. The science is the background. So it is really a story about people, relationships, and the intrigue set in a world that is futuristic in space with a lot of things we don't have today. I think we frequently describe it as it's Bonnie and Clyde meet V for Vendetta in a Firefly-esque universe. So the science has to be logical, and as I think Jody said, it's got to be consistent. So we don't trip over ourselves and do things we said we couldn't do. And hopefully most of what we've used based on the research is it's plausible. It may not be possible yet, but it is how it would work, and it's in theory going to happen that way.
Okay. Nancy, what kind of research did you do for your element of Outcast Station?
Well, I had a little bit of useful background in writing my Marshall character because a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I was a lawyer. I'm happy not to be one anymore, but I do remember what that was like. And I do remember my year doing appointed criminal defense work. So I kind of had a background for that. For Christmas on Outcast Station, however, I wanted to try working with a race that was not entirely human. And so there's something about scorpions I think is just really cool. And so the neighboring star system is a scorpioid species called the Drakens. And so I did research into what do scorpions eat, what kind of environments do they like, and they are an important element in that it's a Christmas story, Scorpions for Christmas. And their problems are the driving force behind this story. So I did a lot of research into that. I looked at some different government systems to see kind of what would be fun to have. And I really give Jeannie a lot of credit because everything like that has to do with how the world is structured, we sat down and did it together. So it's really two people's input coming out with one thing. And it's good too, because with something like Scorpion People, when you get the story read, if the other person goes, this doesn't make any sense, then you know you've got to go look at it and clean it up. So some research, some drawing on past experiences on Grateful or in the past, and that's about it.
Okay, cool. This is one of the things I'm hearing. There seem to be some themes here, and the big one seems to be biology and how important that is in terms of even when you don't have, quote, hard, though you are researching it, science fiction. The other one is basically looking at social and societal relationships. Again, that is a hard science, but we don't frequently treat it as such. And there's something else that seems to be sticking out to me, is that here we've got a panel of 4 women and 1 guy. And I'm wondering, do you suppose there's some sort of gender tendency towards a more expansive view of what constitutes science? Kyoko, I'm going to let you start on this one.
Oh, it's actually interesting that you brought that up too. That's funny because like when I started looking into writing this series, that's the thing I came up against first. I was like, okay, well, I already have to look at the fact that most of the really well-known hard science stories are still written by men. So it's going to be a little bit of an uphill battle because a lot of people still come in with their own biases in terms of what they want to read. So, you see something on the front cover that's, advertised as going to be hard sci-fi, and you see it's written by a woman, some people will kind of automatically stop and go, oh, well, I'm so used to, the guys coming up that have written this genre that I don't know that this person can particularly handle what I'm looking for. But as I continued going through and seeing like the response to, for example, Octavia Butler, someone like that, I could see more and more that to me, the impression that I'm getting is the women who write sci-fi are kind of using it the way that I do, which is like a backdrop to have a bigger conversation. So you are writing about these amazing aliens or these amazing creatures that didn't exist before, and that's to kind of grab the interest. But then after you've already gotten the person in your pages, you're then talking about different issues. So for example, one of the things I went after was kind of a conservationist angle, because originally I had planned for this series to be kind of like a horrible movie, Reign of Fire, if anybody remembers that. It was going to be like
yeah.
Isn't it? I love it. I actually think it's great. Like it's ridiculous.
I think it's a popcorn movie.
Oh yes, it is the definition of a popcorn movie. Like turn your brain off and just watch this ridiculousness unfold. I had a great time, even though I think it's like no. In terms of quality, I would not call it a quality film. But I thought that the thing that always interested me was that it was one of the first times I saw dragons in that context of maybe being hard science. Like, oh, okay, well, what if, even though the movie doesn't go into it, would it be like if they did exist? Because I mean, the movie really kind of brings up the point that they immediately became the dominant species and just wiped everybody out, and nobody could kind of stand up to them. And I think that that's kind of an influence in seeing so many women write this particular type of science, is that a lot of them are focusing on different areas. Like, one of the reasons I didn't read a whole lot of it when I was a kid is because I found that it just wanted to focus on like equations and physics and the stuff that exists in the real life, which is fascinating to people, but just not to me in particular. And so as I continued going through and thinking about this series, that's what I'm noticing, is a lot of people are saying that they're focusing on different areas, on character, on the effects that it would have on society to have these different kinds of really expansive sciences that exist. And so I think that's, I mean, to me, what the difference is in seeing that more women are out there and not being, you know, running into that same wall they saw before of the expectations of prior generations, if that makes any sense.
Nancy, thoughts?
Well, I actually sat on a panel at a con where we were kind of debating that. And the topic that came up was, how thoroughly do you have to explain your propulsion system? Now, I was a history major. Physics is not my thing. If people enjoy writing a detailed explanation of how their ship goes, if that's their jam, that's great. I'm not going to not read their book because of that. But what I will do is, when that starts, I skip down to the point where they do whatever makes the ship go, and then I start reading. And so a couple of other people on the panel said, yeah, I kind of do that too. That's not as important to me. One of the guys on the panel said, oh, I think you have to explain this or you're going to lose the readers. Well, you know, two of us at least on this panel are readers and you don't lose us. But there was a gentleman who is something of a legend in the field, and I'm not going to say who he was because I don't have his permission to quote him. But the discussion moved, you know, as it does down the table, and it got to him, and he said, just push a button and it goes. And I thought, thank you. Mm-hmm. Because to me, it is.
What's in service to your story?
Exactly.
I mean, I'll make some enemies right now. I thought that was one of the problems with the Star Wars prequels that everybody ran into, is that it kept trying to explain itself. And it's like, I don't need that. Like, I want to get invested in the characters that you have, but it would stop every 5 minutes and just like either one, remind you of the originals, or two, it would spend way too much time world building when you're like, well, I mean, that's nice. Okay, that looks pretty cool. But spending entire minutes, like my biggest grudge is with the daggum race in that first one. The pod racing, like someone actually counted, and I think it was either 8 or 15 minutes of the entire film.
So long.
And it arrives at the final point of, he's unusual because he can do stuff that small children can't do. That's literally the point. That was all that was established, but you spent 15 minutes on a pod race to do that. And see, that's one of the things of like, I think that's what people are evolving past, is that some of us, yeah, a lot of us want to know all those teeny weeny details, but a lot of us are like, no, give me a character, give me like a story, give me stuff that I want to focus on and care about.
I think probably the midichlorians come from George Lucas wanting to be like, it is too hard science fiction.
I know, and it just gets like, too far. It was like, well, no, that's fine. There were a lot
that at all.
Yeah, there was a bunch of stuff that would have worked if he wanted to explain it and we wanted to know, but it was like, no, that's not the one. Leave the Force alone.
No, that's fine.
Especially because a simple blood test would reveal if you had Jedi potential, and that means that he could have done what the Pharaoh in Egypt did and killed every child who had any potential for it, and that would be the end of the story. Yeah. So, trying to retcon something that didn't need retconning in the first place was a big fat waste of our brain power, and
people went to the movies.
To try and combine what Jean Marie and Kyoko were saying, though, like Kyoko, I think that you're right. Although there are lots of women science fiction writers who are very happy to dive into the nitty gritty of science with the best of them. But the thing is that when male science fiction writers do that, nobody ever argues about whether or not it's hard science fiction. I have long said hard science fiction just means a dude wrote it. That's it. That's the only definition. You know, nobody argues about whether or not China Miéville is a science fiction writer, despite the fact that it's the least hard science fiction you can possibly imagine for the most part. There's very little science to it at all, but nobody really argues about that. You know, you bring up Star Wars, like there's all kinds of classics of science fiction. There's Heinlein books that have no particular science in them whatsoever, but are always going to be classified in the science fiction section, and no one has this argument. No one like pulls their hair out and frets over whether it's hard enough, unless a woman wrote it, and you can use that to say that she didn't write science fiction. I didn't write science fiction for a long time, literally because of this. I felt like there was no room for me in science fiction. There was room for me in fantasy. You know, there's a lot of women writing fantasy, a lot of different kinds of fantasy. I felt like there was a place for me there, and the kind of things I wanted to do, and what I wanted to do with language, and what I wanted to do with character. But especially when, you know, I'm old. So a while ago when I was starting out, I didn't feel like there was room for me in science fiction. And my first science fiction story is actually, it takes place at a wine tasting. And it's about the wine trade in the far future settled galaxy, which, you know, is girly enough in and of itself and on its own, because it involves something other than blowing things up. But I was terrified writing that story. And as soon as I wrote it, as soon as it was reviewed, people said it wasn't really science fiction. And for a long time, for years, my only goal was to write something that nobody said wasn't really science fiction. And you know what did it? You know what finally did it after all those GD years? Space opera, which is not like it's not hard science fiction at all. It has nothing to do with it has the least to do with science of any science fiction I've ever written, and that was the one nobody complained about. That was the one nobody said anything about science fiction, and probably not coincidentally, it is the only book of mine that my gender has never been brought up in a review.
Ooh.
God knows why. Is it because science fiction comedy automatically gets a pass? Who knows? But I found it very difficult to find my place in the science fiction world as opposed to the fantasy world because of that bias, because of that notion that if a woman writes it, we have to have a conversation about whether it's really science fiction or not, about whether it's hard science fiction or soft science fiction.
I'm really sorry that Catherynne Asaro couldn't make it, because she would have negated
I know, because
what is being said here. She is a scientist.
Is who you would point at. So like
exactly.
She is an incredible example of women writing as hard science-based science fiction as you could possibly want. And she's wonderful. And I mean, it used to be even harder than it is now, and it's not that easy now. And I think that a lot of people who, I say people, I don't want to like turn this into a like white dudes have it easier thing. I don't. But I do think that people who've never had their work questioned that way, just whether their work belongs at all, don't understand how alienating and distancing that can be, and how much it can affect your confidence to write the next book when anything you write is questioned as to whether it should be even allowed in the club.
Yeah.
Oh, it's horrendous.
That's an enormous blind spot that a lot of writers don't think that they have, and to a degree where, I mean, you're so correct that I wrote this kind of like small theme in the books where, again, this is the two scientists that make the dragons are Dr. Rhett Jackson and Dr. Kamala Anjali, and I literally put purposely in the story that people keep trying to give Jack all the credit when Kamala's the one that had the breakthrough that allowed the cloning process to happen. And like every 5 minutes, Jack corrects people. He's like, no, do you see this amazing woman right here? Most of this is her. I know that I'm a white guy. Stop giving me all the credit. She did most of this. And so like I purposely put that in because of that theme in real life of like, oh, well, you know, but you're a woman. So they have to like kind of throw this extra layer of criticism on top that is completely unearned. Everything should just be judged at the same base level of quality and making sure that you care about the work, yet you still see, you know, a certain spotlight being thrown in a particular direction, or a lack of criticism for a certain particular demographic.
We allow the cats.
I know she's,
Unlike children.
Mine is about to jump up here too.
Which one,
she's
Athena
very
or
Athena?
She loves
yeah.
talking to people. So every time she hears me on the phone, she does this. She jumps up and she's like, "Who are you talking to? I want to say hi."
Yeah. Anyway, Jody, you've had
Yes.
so many sci-fis, and you've written with other giants in the genre, including Anne McCaffrey.
Yes.
Have you faced these issues in your science fiction? Because they are real issues.
They are real issues, and it hasn't stopped. I published my first book in 1987, and yes, there've always been the pushback on, well, is it really science fiction if you're writing it? And I just say, yes, it is, and you don't get to ask me that, because accept it, it's here. And if I'm writing about the future, I have male scientists, female scientists, asexual scientists who are doing their job in the same way that leaders are doing their job, actors are doing their job, creators of robots, technology, people who are cooking food, because it shouldn't matter anymore. And I'm going to write as if it doesn't. I'm going to have my characters doing, my female characters are going to be having just as exciting adventures as my male characters, because I don't want someone to pick it up and say, okay, this is an adventure only a man can have. I'm not going to do that, because I don't want to encourage that thought. And whether or not it's true now, and yeah, it is. I know too many female scientists, female teachers, female doctors. My cousin is an OBGYN, and she gets this kind of pushback still. I don't want to normalize it in my fiction. In the same way that Nichelle Nichols put women and women of color on the bridge of the Enterprise in 1965, she made it possible for Dr. Mae Jemison to go into space because she encouraged her to do that by her very presence. And I want my fiction to have some of that in it too. So we are entertainers, we are also educators. We bring up these cool facts that we come up with, but we also have our own point of view, and that will be stated not with a hammer over the head, but with perhaps a gentle feather to the ribs. People absorb a lot more if they're laughing. They do.
Yes, they will. And Larry, as the father of daughters, I know that these issues are important to you. How I know also that you're using them in your fiction. I mean, yeah, the whole thing is have a good story, have an exciting adventure. But how are you helping to create the future in your space opera? And I know you're doing it, and I know Gail wouldn't let you get away with not doing it. So,
well, and it's something.
Pressure, Larry.
It's something that we agree on, so it makes it very simple. Which is, even with Wyatt and Beth, Beth is really the brains. She is the stronger stabilizer in that story. She's also the moral compass. So I think part of what we try to do is tell a story and, yes, keep some moral lessons in it, sort of harking back to the Star Trek example of you change it so you're telling a story, but it's not immediate for everyone to say, oh, you're hitting me upside the head with this issue. No, we're just trying to point it out in a way that you can understand it, seeing it through someone else's eyes. So I think that's very important. And sadly, we have seen, because even when we were batting around the idea of doing science fiction, we had publishers say, if it comes out under Gail's name, it's going to be a really hard sell. So we personally experienced that even when we did the steampunk, which is a sort of different edge of science fiction. And the same thing was said, if Larry's name's on it with you, it will do better. So we have personally experienced that and trying to fight against it. And yes, my daughters are very professional and would have a word with me if we ever deviated from our representation. But I think that just, it makes it a better story for all our audience. And I think you have to look at who are your readers. And some of it is, when I did the research for this and watched what was popular in the media for other movies and series, I think it's changing. Not that there isn't still a battle, especially for the women creators, but what people are expecting is less about the hard science and the military science than it is telling a good story about people.
People oriented. Yeah, I think it's people that people connect with.
I
Now,
love that your cat, Kyoko, is sitting there like, yeah, that's so cute.
I told you
That's so crap.
she will watch. Yeah, she'll watch TV and she'll just like listen to the conversation. She is intently focused on our conversation.
That's wonderful. She's so good too. She's not trying to get on the keyboard.
how many of us have black cats?
Mine's a tuxedo. He has half a mustache.
Oh, that's great.
Oh, how cute.
I thought Athena was going to jump up here, but she hasn't yet.
Okay.
No, there's a door closed, or Lord Byron would be in here and up in all your faces, and he is a 25-pound Maine Coon. So,
Oh, you have a Maine Coon.
Oh,
I do.
You have to show photos later.
Oh yeah, no
Yeah.
problem. No, he's a very handsome fellow, and he is extremely interested in being on camera at all times. He always wears his tux, but
Bustopher Jones.
he's being kept out of here by a door and a soundproof curtain.
And the reason our lady has joined us is if I shut that door, she will cry through the entire thing. So I was like, you know what? She was asleep before. I'm just gonna.
Oh, she's been so good just because she's allowed to participate.
Exactly.
Yes. Cool. I mean, there is science fiction about cats, so we know this. Anyway,
Cats in space opera.
I write it.
yes, I know, and I've read some of it too. Anyway, just a couple more questions before we go. And the first one is, we've shown here through your fiction some of the scope of science fiction that can be found now, you know, the wideness that defies the cliches. I'm going to ask you all to give me some of your inspirations or the people you're reading now that you'd like our viewers to check out. Nancy, I'm going to start with you.
Well, some of the earliest science fiction I read was Darkover. And I didn't even realize it was classified science fiction because it was on another planet. I just thought they were cool telepathy stories. And so Darkover is not really, really heavy on the science. And then Pern, when I first started reading Anne McCaffrey, I didn't realize the dragons had been bred to fight Thread. You know, if you don't pick up the right book first, you don't learn these things until later. S.M. Sterling, his Emberverse series, aliens alter the laws of physics so that, and I'm blanking on it, but internal combustion engines won't work, gunpowder won't explode, that kind of thing. So it's an alteration to the laws of physics. In the later books, I think he added some magic, but I'm sort of at the point where when the books are door stoppers and they come out at long intervals, I wait until I have the latest set of door stoppers. I buy them as they come out to support the series, and then I read them all. So I haven't read the more recent ones in that. And then you could go back to Mark Twain, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, because that's time travel and modern technology with the medieval mind. And so,
humor.
And humor, Mark Twain. I mean, although, you know, as a Middle Ages history geek, his version of the Middle Ages was somewhat distressing. It wasn't the Ren Fair with antibiotics and running water. It was a lot grimmer than that. And I would just add one other thing. I first was exposed to telepathy reading The Adventures of the Legion of Superheroes and Saturn Girl, their telepath character. And I still read The Adventures of the Legion of Superheroes. And the science is, I mean, they have the science police, but technically it verges on space fantasy, I think. So that's my list.
Okay. Kyoko?
So I'll do kind of part one and part two of the question. So one thing I would recommend, a hard sci-fi that I enjoyed was the Earthrise series by M.C.A. Hogarth. It was really fun to read just because, again, it had a woman of color is the captain of the ship. It's very, very Firefly, but the hilarious part is I read later she's never seen Firefly. But there's a bunch of, like, the way that the the crew is composed, it almost perfectly matches to a degree. Especially, again, you have a grumpy captain and this like ethereal, beautiful love interest who just constantly ticks him off. And they're absolutely in love with each other, which of course in Firefly's case would be Mal and Inara. But I liked it because it combined a bunch of really interesting elements together. So you had your, being out in space and kind of same thing. They were, they weren't criminals or anything, but they would just like, take cargo from place to place, and they happen to bump into this guy who's in a bunch of trouble, and they end up picking him up and then they go. But she has a lot of elements I didn't really see a lot in her sci-fi that were in her stories, like again, anthropomorphic people, and the love interest guy is, I don't know if you guys watched anime growing up, but he is exactly a Bishonen. So like this beautiful, pale, larger than life, drama queen type of character that ends up kind of being the damsel in a way.
And your recommendation?
Yeah, that's my recommendation.
Yeah, that's recommendation, but not inspiration. Okay.
Correct. Yes. So
all right.
My inspiration, I would say, especially of Cinder and Bone, it's funny now because it's been out for about 4 years, is that I've had a couple of reviewers be like, it's like Jurassic Park with dragons. And I was like, great, I was going for that. So, I actually did read Jurassic Park when I was a kid, and I liked it quite a bit, but I've always been deeply drawn to the movie because it's terrifying and fascinating, and it's well acted, and it's like really sharply written. And like of course you love dinosaurs when you're a kid, and I got older and I find myself really rewatching the scene where they're at the table and they're having that conversation about, man versus God versus nature. Like, do we have the right, even though we have the ability to make these creatures, should we have done this at all? And I think that really heavily influenced how I decided to write Of Cinder and Bone, because in this case, it's actually flipped. The dragons were minding their own business, and the entire world decided to turn it into like almost a capitalist kind of dragon hunting craze. And so they went and just wiped the entire species out because it became such a part of the culture to be like, oh, well, I brought home the biggest dragon. No, I did, and that kind of thing. And so
big game hunting.
Yes, it just became this big game hunting phenomenon until they literally killed them all off. And so there were these centuries go by and people weren't able to learn that much about them because they were dead. And so that was Jack's motivation of bringing them back. It wasn't for a park. It wasn't for entertainment. It was like, we cut off an amazing resource of knowledge. And that was really his motivation, is that I want to learn more about these things. If we were able to bring them to life, keep them safe, and put them in a context of, we just want them to be alive. We are not trying to profit off them. We're not trying to do anything. So that was the inspiration.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Larry?
I'd say my inspiration was really C.J. Cherryh.
Mm-hmm.
Were the first books that I read that I would consider just really good science fiction and sort of got me hooked. Also Ursula K. Le Guin. Some that I've read more recently that I've just really enjoyed is David Weber, who that may be a common one for guys, but I just enjoy it. It's a fun story and a fun read.
There are no wrong answers.
And out of loyalty, I also have to say David Drake, which is more military sci-fi, but still he writes a good book.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Catherynne?
Well, so I mean, if we're talking about specific books, I feel like the elephant in the room with space opera is always Douglas Adams. And I talk about it in the acknowledgments. Douglas Adams sort of haunts the entire field of science fiction comedy. John Scalzi once called Hitchhiker's Guide an extinction level event for science fiction comedy, and it is. But for me, it was kind of freeing. Like, are you going to write the greatest science fiction comedy novel? No. Which felt, all the pressure was off. Like, I could shoot for the bronze, it would be fine. But at the same time, I have British people in space, and you're never not going to evoke Douglas Adams a little bit when you have British people in space. You might veer toward Doctor Who and then remember that Douglas Adams wrote Doctor Who. So like it goes back and forth. But I felt like a big part. I mean, I read Douglas Adams as a kid. God, we all did, and read the lines to your friends, and you love it, and you can't believe anybody wrote anything this clever with the English language, and it's so wonderful. But I felt like what I could do was just get like gross American feelings all over it. Just like put all of my emotions in there, make it way more queer and make it way less white, and just make it all kinds of feelings. And that's what I tried to do. And you know, in the end, somebody told me they saw a teenager reading lines from space opera out loud to their friend at a pride parade, and like that is the great circle come round of science fiction comedy. So I'm very proud of that. But Douglas Adams and David Bowie were the two angels on my shoulders, writing space opera. I don't think, if you look at what I read growing up as far as science fiction, it's not going to be a very woke list. I read what a lot of people read when they were growing up. You know, I loved Dune. I probably read Dune more than it is cool to have read a 6-book series. And I loved Greg Bear, The Forge of God, Anvil of Stars, Dyad. I just absolutely adored. I chewed through Asimov like crazy. Like these are, it's a bunch of old white guys because that's what was available on the shelves. I was a lot more adventurous a reader in fantasy, but I think that it was possible to be in the 80s and 90s because of the very phenomenon that I was talking about, was not feeling like there was a space in science fiction. Like women were booming in fantasy in the 80s and 90s, and it was a lot harder for them to be accepted in science fiction. So yeah, I read what was on my dad's shelves, like we all did. Now that I have a small child, I feel like the responsibility of what's on my bookshelf is intense. As far as what I'd recommend today, Becky Chambers is doing some awesome stuff with science fiction. Obviously, N.K. Jemisin is a legend. It's kind of an easy out to recommend her because she's just so incredible. And I really enjoyed the Planetfall series by Emma Newman recently. It really felt kind of old school science fiction to me, but you know, without all the problematic stuff. And it's that thriller kind of can't wait to see what happens next thing. But my biggest recommendation would be that I think a lot of the most exciting stuff happening in science fiction today is happening in short fiction. And I just recommend going out there and reading through all of the online zines that you can find and discovering new writers, because some of the really freshest stuff is in short science fiction. I feel like film science fiction always lags at least 10 to 20 years behind printed science fiction, and novel-length science fiction lags 5 years behind short science fiction. So like the bleeding edge to me is short fiction, and I really think that, especially with all of our attention spans suffering these days, just like go out and grab those little moments of the future.
Of the joy, yes. Jody, what would be your recommendations, your inspirations from the past, your recommendations for today?
Well, absolutely Mark Twain was an inspiration for me, and A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court in particular, because time travel, fantasy humor, and naturally the Matter of Britain, because all of us have within us somewhere a King Arthur story of some kind. And it's in his bursting out of it, it was American ingenuity overcomes the Matter of Britain, because of course, why not? But I had a lot of, I didn't really come into classic science fiction that I knew of. I just read everything that there was in the school library. And one of them was, I'm trying to remember the name of the author, but the first science fiction book I can remember reading was by a woman. It was called The Incredible Flight to the Mushroom Planet, about these little children who build their own spaceships, sort of a la the movie Explorers, and off they go to have a science fiction adventure. But I didn't separate it in any way from the other stuff I was reading, because almost all children's fiction is fantasy of some kind. It's hardly ever what we would refer to as mainstream fiction. So I read lots of that stuff. But I was also very interested in mythology of the time, and I read Norse mythology, I read Greek mythology, Native American mythology, African mythology, a little Australian. There wasn't a lot available, but my school library had a fantastic section of these things, and it played on my imagination. And yes, I read comic books. And it's funny that you should mention Saturn Girl, because I always wanted to be Chameleon Boy. I wanted to be able to change my shape whenever I wanted to. The Legion of Superheroes was tremendously interesting to me. And Yeah, I went for things that involved women where I could find them. Even as a child, I had a subscription to Lois Lane comic magazine. You probably didn't even know that existed, but by God, it cost me $3 for a year subscription, and that was hard to put together. As for people that I have read and am reading, Ursula K. Le Guin, I have not yet read everything that she wrote, and she blows my mind every time I pick her stuff up. Yes, the old white men, but they're still mind-blowing for all the fact that, yes, they were old white men who were writing science fiction, have mind-blowing concepts. And a lot of them were more, they wanted to be more woke than they were in most cases. There's some things that are absolutely just, you look back at them and roll your eyes. But for the most part, there are people out there who are doing really good stuff now. I am tremendously sorry always that we lost Terry Pratchett, because I think he's one of the greatest writers that we've ever had. I think he's our Shakespeare because he understood human nature in a way that most people just don't get into that depth. And he loved them too, which is something that you can tell when people love their characters when they don't. And he did love his characters. Let's see. Of course, Anne McCaffrey, she was not only an inspiration to me, but also a mentor. I wrote several books with her. And it was a real privilege to have that happen. Douglas Adams, yep. I thought his stuff was tremendously funny. The video of the original Hitchhiker's Guide does not wear well. It's so dated and so slow paced that it's just painful to look at right now, but the humor is still there. I mean, having somebody roll their eyes and say, not again, you have this vision of a bowl of petunias and a whale falling out of the sky. Let's see, of people who are doing really good things now, yeah, David Weber is terrific. If you want a 60-page battle at sea, he's your man, but also he writes very good characters. Nnedi Okorafor is writing amazing stuff. I think Lagoon is just tremendous, and the other things that she's doing, Binti Akatowicz, all of her other work, Shauna McGuire is coming up and doing beautiful things. Sarah Pinsker. Let's see. There's so much good stuff that comes across my desk. For a while there, we were my husband and I were the fiction reviewers for Galaxy's Edge magazine. So we got far too many really wonderful books, and we're only able to recommend a certain number because of the length of the column that we had available to us. But we build upon what we had before us, as the writers of the past did on the things that inspired them. So I think that we're getting more sophisticated and more interested in different and wonderful things as we go along. And there are going to be people who build upon us, and we're going to read those and admire them in the future.
That's a good closing line. So and we're coming up really against our time. So I'm going to ask everybody to tell our viewers where they can find you on the web. And don't worry if you can't catch it as folks are saying it, because we will repeat it at the end. Jody?
My website, which needs severe updating, is jodylynnye.com. That's 3 N's in a row. And I am on Facebook at Jody Lynn Nye. So come by, drop a note, and have a conversation.
Great. Kyoko?
So you can find all of my work on Amazon and Smashwords. So I've got the 2 series. So first one, of course, is Of Cinder and Bone. That's the Dragon Sci-Fi series. And then we've got the Black Parade series, which is urban fantasy and paranormal romance. My website is shewhowritesmonsters.com. You can find all my links to everything is going to be there. I'm on Facebook as well under the same name for She Who Writes Monsters.
That's a great title, I gotta say. That really is. Nancy?
My website is nancynorthcott.com. I have a Facebook page, which is Nancy Northcott Author. I have to confess I'm not there as probably as much as I should be, but you can almost always catch me on Twitter, where I'm at Nancy Northcott.
Cool. Larry?
You can find me at larrynmartin.com. It's a site that I share with Gail Z. Martin, and you can find not only all our books and links to where you can buy them in audio, ebook, and print, but you can also find all our social connections for Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter. All of them are there. It's one stop, LarryAnnMartin.com.
Great. Catherynne?
My website is CatherynneValente.com. You can find me on Twitter at CatValente. You can find me on Patreon at CatValente and on YouTube at CatValente Live.
Great, great. Well, thank you all. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm sorry I had to sort of chivvy people along, but I was looking at the time. We could have talked for far longer, but thank you all for joining us here today, and thank you all in the audience for joining us on the writing track at Continual. If you enjoyed what you saw, please like, share, follow, and subscribe. Thank you.
Bye.